to my knowledge, and I think to a lot of biblical scholars, but I can't name any off the top of the head because it's something I just recently was reading. But
to my knowledge, and to a lot of biblical scholars, but I can't name any. And you still thought it was a good idea to try to go up there and debate this topic. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Cross Unit. I'm your host, Brother Maverick, and today we have another one. A kid stepping up to Dr. Frank Turek, who says, hey man, I don't think we can trust the Bible, and I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why. But then he uses the same tired old nonsense that's been debunked time and time again. So let's go ahead and listen to this conversation, guys. And as usual, you'll catch my thoughts a little in the middle and, of course, on the other side. Let's man up.
Yes. Hello, my name is Matthew.
Hey, Matthew.
So I'm just curious because you earlier were mentioning something about how we don't necessarily need the Bible to understand morality. Is that correct?
You get more details in the Bible that you wouldn't have if you didn't have it. But basic right and wrong, thou shalt not kill, murder, steal, that we know that intuitively.
Okay. So I guess my question is, so assuming that's true either way, would you agree the Bible is written by men?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's written by men, yeah.
And this is something that I could struggle with, but I study linguistics and I do a lot of stuff with languages, and to my knowledge, and I think to a lot of biblical scholars, but I can't name any off the top of the head because it's something I just recently was reading, but ancient, it was like some form of like ancient Greek was the original version of language that the New Testament was written in. Is that what you believe as well?
Jesus probably spoke either Aramaic or Hebrew, and it was written in Koine Greek, yes.
So right off the bat, guys, and I hate to interrupt this early, but the kid already started off putting himself in a position where he lost this debate, this discussion, whatever you want to call it. You start off by asking an idiotic question. Was the Bible written by men? Obviously, it was divinely inspired by men. Who would you want to write the Bible? Animals? Zebras? Lions? I mean, who else would write the Bible, right? Number one, the Bible is clear that it was written by men, divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit. All right, I hate that argument because it's idiotic. Every other book that's ever been written in humankind has been written by men, and nobody decides to question it. But for some reason, people think that the very basis and foundation of how things are written is a way to question the credibility of the Bible. It is absolutely stupid. Then you move on to say that there are renowned biblical scholars who doubt the credibility of the Bible, but yet you cannot name any. So you're basically just making things up and you're throwing things at the wall and hoping that they stick. And this is already a very bad position for this kid to be in.
How do we believe, or how do you believe rather, it might be a better question, the Bible was written originally? So do you believe, up there it says opponents admitted gospels written by disciples. Are you saying written, like the gospels according to Mark were written by Mark, or are you saying that just disciples is in somebody that follows like the teachings of the Bible or something like that?
Who wrote the gospels is the question? Or
Yeah, just addressing the one point saying the opponents admitted gospels written by disciples. So I was just wanting a clarification.
Okay, yes. Well, as far as we know, the writers of the New Testament, there's 8 or 9 writers depending upon who wrote Hebrews. Most of them bear the name of the person, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, except, the letters of the Apostle Paul, there's about 13 of them. And then there's other letters written by people like Peter, Jude.
So clarification, you believe
James.
Gospels according to Mark was written by Mark?
Yes.
Okay. The same exact disciples written in the Bible, so Mark in the Bible wrote Gospels according to Mark. Yes?
He wrote the gospel according to Mark. That's what the earliest evidence shows, yes.
Well,
now, he was probably getting his information mostly from Peter. That's the thought there.
Well, I would say that most of the evidence points to that being completely false because the people at his time and Mark, the position that he was in socioeconomically, had no knowledge of Greek at all.
So again, the kid's arguments are based in absolute arrogance. I'm a Hispanic man, okay? I'm Puerto Rican. There are people who come up to me and ask me if I know how to speak Spanish. Now, mind you, I've spoken Spanish since I was born, and there are still people who don't know that I speak Spanish. This kid wants to make an assumption about an apostle who lived thousands of years ago and say, well, he was poor. Therefore, there's no way that he spoke Greek. You're joking, right? The fact that people can reach out so far and try to connect the dots that aren't there isn't even laughable to me. I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so pathetic. How could you make such an assumption about somebody and say, well, he was this person, he was a fisherman, so therefore he couldn't have spoken Greek. There are people who know me for years that don't know I know how to speak Spanish. So if people who actually know me don't know something so fundamental about me, how could this kid with little to no knowledge about anything know something so intimate about a man who lived thousands of years ago? Absolutely ridiculous.
Oh, no, sure they did.
I disagree. I think most historians would disagree with that, and I think most biblical scholars admit that Mark did not write the Gospels according to Mark.
What historians?
You just attest to it.
Which historians?
Well, wait. Are you saying Koine Greek did not exist in the first century?
No. I'm saying that most people spoke Aramaic at that time. Most people also did not speak Hebrew, ancient Hebrew. That was mostly attested to religious figures. And as fishermen and as these followers of Jesus, they were not in the church. They were not wealthy. They did not have high socioeconomic standing that is associated with knowing either ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek.
Well, what you're doing, though, is you're taking aggregate data, Matthew, and you're applying it to individuals. And you can't do that. You can go the other way.
Sorry, why not?
It would be like saying that...
I mean, we look at statistics, we look at evidence, and we say, to our best of the knowledge, people of his socioeconomic standing did not have the knowledge of this language to be able to write the Gospels according to Mark in point A Hebrew.
What you can't do is, like suppose you say that the average, I'm making something up, the average income in Fairfax, Virginia is $100,000 a year per household. And that's the average. You can say, okay, that's the average, but you can't point at one person in here and say, you're making $100,000. You can't take aggregate data and apply it to individuals, just like you can't take the aggregate of the knowledge of the first century and apply it to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John.
Where do we see any evidence or statements that are reliable saying that Mark is able to speak and write exquisite point A?
The early church fathers widely attested the gospel writers to the names that we have now, and there is no other data from that time period which suggests any other authors.
Sorry, but the religious figures at that time are very notorious for completely fabricating information or records about religion.
Matthew, you are again taking aggregate data and applying it to individuals.
And I'm saying that because we have no knowledge of these specific people at that time, we have to go by the best possible information.
No, we do have knowledge. We have people writing and attesting about it.
Yeah, you're saying religious figures who, again, are notorious for going back into the period of time that Jesus existed, where the records were contemporaneous.
Matthew, let me ask.
So this kid has a problem with the fact that people wrote and attested to specific accounts in the Bible. And the only reason he has a problem with that is because it's the Bible. Men wrote countless historical texts, and him nor anyone else who is a non-believer would never question that. But because it's the Bible, all of a sudden he's worried about people who might have supposedly altered things purposely, which has been debunked historically and archaeologically thousands of times, but he continues to ignore that. And mind you, this is this very same person who said that he knows of scholars who can prove this, but doesn't know any of their names and doesn't have any evidence to cite. Very convenient when you're in a debate.
Ask you a question.
Sure.
What would the writers of the New Testament, what motivation would these people have to invent all this?
I don't claim to know any motivation.
Duh.
Okay, so then why are you applying nefarious motives to these people that you don't even know?
Are you talking about... No, I'm talking about two separate people. You're saying that we have writings from religious figures who, in that same vein, fabricated evidence, such as... I don't remember the exact guy's name, but there was a really famous... I think it was like Josephus, who's a very famous
I don't know his name.
historian.
Josephus.
But I'm going to talk about him.
Sorry, pronunciation's wrong. I wasn't sure the exact pronunciation, but he's very
Now remember, this kid studies linguistics, but he can't say the name Josephus.
famous for being very... what's the word, strict in writing about historical figures, especially religious Messiah figures at the time. And it's been pretty accurately debunked that the writing that was in Josephus's work about Jesus existing was completely fabricated by religious figures at the time.
Okay, well, first of all, that's not true.
That is true.
No.
I mean, we can disagree, but there's one.
That's true. I can't tell you how it's true. I can't tell you who supposedly debunked it, but I'm just going to keep repeating it because I really want it to be true. Got it.
One truth. So.
First of all, the only way you can tell if somebody is misquoting something is if you know what the actual quote was. You're talking about the famous passage in Josephus. Now, scholars do agree that Christians altered some of what he said, but we have an Arabic version that appears unaltered. Ooh. And it still talks about Jesus, and Josephus also talks about Jesus when he talks about the death of Jesus' brother James. But I don't know what that has to do with Mark writing Mark. Let's just say you're right. Let's just say we don't know who wrote the Gospels. So, does that mean that what was written in the Gospels is false?
No, I'm not saying that. I was just saying that it shows that they're trying to put this in a more elegant situation, but to attest that the writers were there at the time and that these specific biblical figures lends truth, if you believe in that, to the authenticity of the Bible. And I'm just saying that that does not seem to be the case.
Okay.
I'm saying you use that as further proof, once you already believe, of evidence of, oh, look, Mark was there, Mark wrote the Bible, this has to be true, or this is more likely to be true.
Okay, look, yeah, we know documents and sources were written very early. I didn't have time to go through it here. Even Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic from UNC Chapel Hill, admits Paul writes 1 Corinthians in 55 AD. And an ancient creed that talks about Jesus dying and rising from the dead and everybody that he appeared to comes all the way from the 30s AD. It can't be legendary. That creed is put in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. This is very early stuff. It cannot be legendary. Now, the question is, how do you interpret the data, not what is the data? People, atheists, Christians, everyone in between, agree on the data. The question is, how do you interpret it? Do you say Jesus rose from the dead or not? You know, Bart Ehrman, the great skeptic at UNC Chapel Hill, will not take a position on an alternative explanation for the resurrection because he knows that every position he tries to take has holes in it that can't support the weight of the evidence.
First of all, let's start with some truth that's straight out of the Bible, okay? 2 Peter 1:21 says, "For no prophecy was ever produced by the will of man, but men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit." That in and of itself already dismantles the idea that the Bible is just another man-made document. The Word of God was never just conjured up by random people. It was divinely inspired and, till this day, historically preserved. Now, let's talk about this student's arguments, okay? Because it was riddled with factual errors and baseless assumptions from which I have no idea where he got. First, he tries to undermine the Gospels by questioning their authorship. And he claims that Mark supposedly could not have written the Gospel because of his socioeconomic status. But that's not how history works, no matter how bad you want it to. The ability to write in Greek wasn't reserved for the elite or rich people. It was the common trade language of the Roman Empire. Mark, as Peter's close associate, had both access to the information and the ability to document the Gospels accurately. Even secular historians acknowledge that the Gospel of Mark is one of the earliest and most reliable historical sources on Jesus Christ. But then he scatters around and tries to move to this classic skeptical talking point that religious figures fabricated evidence. Yet he never cites any real sources beyond vague references to biblical scholars and his personal intuition, which is absolutely ridiculous. But here's the biggest problem. If early Christians were making these things up, they were the worst liars in history. And why is that? Because they wrote down embarrassing details that no one, and I mean no one, fabricating a religious movement would ever include about themselves. Like, for example, Peter denying Christ, the disciples running in fear, and women being the first witnesses to the resurrection, which carried no legal credibility at the time. These aren't the tactics of people trying to invent a legend. They're the marks of honest and historical accounts. Then there was this claim that Josephus's writings about Jesus were entirely fabricated. Again, wrong, which this kid was the entire time. Now, yes, later Christian scribes added embellishments, but we have earlier manuscripts, including an Arabic version, that show that Josephus did in fact document Jesus as a real historical figure. The overwhelming majority of scholars, Christian and secular alike, agree that Josephus's mention of Jesus is authentic. The attempt to erase that fact is nothing more than wishful thinking. And finally, the most telling part of the exchange was when Frank Turek asked him why. Why would the disciples make all of this up? And what did he say? Nothing. He had nothing to say. Of course he didn't. He had no answer. And that's because there is no answer. At least he was honest about that. The disciples had no motive to fabricate the resurrection. They gained no wealth, no power, no luxury, only persecution and death. Horrible persecution and death. You don't willingly die for something that you know is a lie. That alone shuts down the argument that they invented Christianity for personal gain. What personal gain? The gain to get skinned alive or crucified upside down makes absolutely no sense. But at the end of the day, this was another case of someone dismissing evidence because they don't like the conclusion. History does not care about your little personal biases. The Bible isn't some unreliable secondhand myth. It's historically and spiritually unparalleled, backed by eyewitness testimony, archaeological confirmation, and the extremely real transformation it continues to bring until this day, unlike every other religion out there. John 17:17 says, "Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is the truth. You can doubt it, you can debate it, but the truth stands unshaken. And one day, whether skeptics like it or not, they'll have to face it." Hey guys, I pray to God that you liked the video, and if you did, please type amen in the comment section if you agree, and if you don't, go ahead and leave those comments also. Just keep it respectful. As always, please don't forget to like the video, hit the sub button, share the video, and smash that bell for event notifications, guys, so you never miss a new video. If you love what you see and you want to become a channel sponsor, you can hit that join button where the sponsorship trailer will explain the different tier options and the perks that you'll get as a result of joining each individual plan. Also, don't forget to check out our merch store, as I recently added a ton of new merchandise to the store, and I would love to see nothing more than to see some of you guys wearing the Cross Unit logo out there in the wild. Lastly, the link to my Buy Me a Coffee is there as well. Of course, you're not required to do any of that. Just having you here with me is more than enough, and I am extremely grateful to God for your fellowship. As always, guys, be safe, be good, and be blessed. Remember that Jesus is King and the literal only way to heaven. So for those of you who haven't started a relationship with him yet, please consider it, because when he comes back for his people, it's gonna happen just like this.